docent here at the museum. His name is Gene Festa, and he will be taking you through the many lessons here in the museum. Steve?
Thank you, Laura. Welcome again. I'd like to add my welcome. My name is Gene Festa. I'm a volunteer docent here at the museum. I'm a retired middle school teacher, and I've been involved with teaching the Holocaust for about 20 years. I also began to be a docent at the First of Houston, and now here for just about that much time also. I don't know what your background is, how much you know about the Holocaust, but I have a young lady here. Have you read anything from the Holocaust? What have you read?
Two books. One is called, I don't remember what it was called, but it was about two sisters.
Yes.
Good, okay, so you know about the Holocaust. I'm assuming the rest of the people here have some knowledge of the Holocaust. What we like to do is take you around the museum today. I'll be using a PowerPoint, and I'll be walking around a little bit, not too much, so that we can keep live streaming this. So we'd like to welcome you, as I said, to the museum, and if you have any questions, you can just tell me. Okay, put your hand up. I'd like to begin with a quote we have at the end of our tour. This is a very important thing for us to understand, because you know the Holocaust is about history, and history is really not valuable to us unless we learn from it, is it? And you know, sometimes students think, oh, we're just learning a bunch of facts about nothing, it's just old-fashioned things. But the fact is, history's a great teacher, because you see, it teaches us what we did right, that we should probably imitate, even improve on, or what we did wrong, and of course, what we should eliminate and not do. That's why I like history. I'm a very, very big fan of history. This is a quote from our museum founder that I think just about sums up everything about why we're here. It sums up really why I've been involved in 25 years teaching the Holocaust. A Holocaust is our legacy. You know, what is a legacy? A legacy is something that we inherit from someone else, because most of us were probably not alive during the Holocaust time. So we got this. This is what we received. We forget it at our peril. If we forget what we received, then it's at our peril. We're going to have a problem. If we choose to learn from it, we may use it to light the path to a better world, where all of us see ourselves in the faces of strangers. What I often tell groups of students is, if that's the only thing you learned today, that would make me happy. So that you would leave here with a more compassionate heart, and you would have feel for other people, and you would see the evil in the world and you want to do something about it. The Holocaust, you have to remember, was a state-sponsored. That's interesting, because that's very unique. That had never happened. It was sponsored by the state. It was a persecution and murder of at least 6 million Jews and many other people. As a matter of fact, we really don't know how many people died during this time. Because during the time of the World War II, you had people, soldiers on both sides, people on both sides, and many other victims besides the Jews. Some people say as many as 40 million people died at this time, unnecessarily too. And the Nazis were a party that ran Germany at this time. When you think of Nazis, who do you think of? Adolf Hitler, right? Well, Adolf Hitler, let me see if I can get to the map somewhere. There we go. Adolf Hitler was actually from Austria. Austria, you'll see, is real close to Germany. They spoke the same language, and so it was a very close relationship. Now, I always ask students the question, how did Hitler, born in Austria, end up in Germany, north of Austria, and not only in Germany, but eventually one day in charge? How did that happen? In the First World War, Adolf Hitler, who was, let's say, his background was perhaps not normal, and trouble at some time, and because he was looking for employment, really, he tried to join the Austrian army in the First World War. He was turned down, and so he went across the border to Germany, and he joined out the army. And during one of the battles, he was gassed, taken off the battlefield, and then was considered to be a casualty of the war and a war hero. And he was awarded the Iron Cross. The Iron Cross is the equivalent of what for us?
The Purple Heart?
Purple Heart. So he was considered a war hero. If you look at pictures of him, I think I'll show you one in a minute, but there is one back here behind you, and it shows Hitler at a rally with hundreds of thousands of people, and you'll notice on his jacket he's wearing the Iron Cross. And he always wore the cross. If you look at other pictures, all the time, on his shirt or on his jacket, there was the Iron Cross to tell the German people, I gave my blood for you. I'm a German. So Hitler stayed in Germany and began to be involved in whatever he could be. Still having a problem getting employed, considered himself an artist, but he wasn't. But one thing he did do was join this new political party, Nazis. And he became very good at speaking. He could speak to groups and he could motivate people, and he became very popular in the Nazi party. A lot of times people speak about Hitler's hatred of Jews, and it's kind of difficult to really pinpoint where that came from, but he was obsessed with his hatred for Jews. And for a while, at the beginning, he would get involved in discussions about the current situation in Germany. What's the current situation? Well, the First World War had left Germany, as well as other countries, in a pretty bad condition. And the other thing that, of course, was pretty bad was the international, if you will, the world depression. So things weren't, the economy was bad, people didn't have jobs, they weren't making money, they were hungry. There were just terrible problems. And a lot of times when you have a problem, who do you blame? The government, right? Which he, was very, very outspoken in his criticism of government. Hitler ended up getting arrested a couple times, put into jail, and for short periods of time. And while there, it's important to know he began to write his memoirs, his autobiography. Already, really, if you think about it, he hadn't done anything. But he wrote his autobiography called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, My Battle. The important thing about that is that it's not very good literature. And the other thing is that he, in his writing, begins to blame the Jewish people for the problems. He makes them a scapegoat. You know what a scapegoat is? Somebody you blame for a problem. So he makes the Jewish people a scapegoat. And so you see in that writing his hatred of Jews. And even to a point when I've actually discussed this with students, shown them excerpts where he actually uses the Bible to justify what he says, which is a good lesson for young people. You need to not only read a portion of the Bible, but you need to study about it and study history and know what was going on, and not just take it for what's right there and let somebody convince you what it means. You need to be smart enough to have studied and be able to make your own decisions about that. So it's an important thing I tell students all the time. Stay in school. Go to school. So Hitler takes over how? In 1933, there is an election because the president is old, von Hindenburg, and the government's going to have an election. And so, of course, the Nazi Party puts up some candidates. But when the election is finished, they find out that nobody has a majority. And so what to do? The man wanted to retire. He was quite old. And so they decided to look and see which political party had more votes. Not necessarily the majority, and of course the Nazi Party did. And they were allowed to choose a leader, and they chose Adolf Hitler. By that time he was quite popular. He was quite a speaker. So he gets into a position of leadership without being elected, really. And eventually when the president does retire, he is made chancellor of the whole country. He's in charge. Now, when Hitler takes over, you have to know that there was much anti-Semitism, especially among the Nazis. And so when you you wonder, how did they go from that moment when Hitler takes over to this horrible thing we call the Holocaust? You have to remember, it wasn't something that happened overnight. It had been going on for a long time. In fact, if you look through history, there are examples of anti-Semitism for centuries. Even the Jewish people in Palestine suffered from hatred for them. They had to flee their country, the latest time being in the year 70 of the Common Era, when the diaspora, or the diaspora took place. When they went to all over the world and settled all over the place. And you have to understand that everywhere they went, they encountered anti-Semitism. You can look at the history through the centuries and see laws that were always passed against them. Laws that very interestingly become repeated in the 20th century now when the Nazis take over. Similar laws. Laws that we know things happened to the Jewish people in the 20th century, but these things have been going on for centuries. So we have a chart up here which is interesting about the escalation. What happens? People start talking badly about you. They began to censor, not allow you to read things or not allow things to be written or read. And so slowly, it gets bigger and bigger. Propaganda. There was so much propaganda against the Jewish people when the Nazis took over. You know, they might not have had the internet. They might not have had things we have today, but they had posters. They had radio. They had flyers, books, newspapers, where they could influence the what was said. Posters like that one back there that you see in the back here, where you have caricatures of the Jewish people to scare people. This was done to scare people and turn them against the Jewish people. And this was a cartoon, but it was anti-Jewish. And here was a newspaper with headlines, you know, the slogan of this newspaper was that Jews are our misfortune. But I was pointing out to look at the way that they drew the Jewish people. And you see many times they drew them with little, small, beady eyes, big noses to scare people. Beady eyes, small beady eyes are the sign of a bad guy, a gangster. And so they would do that. In fact, there was a famous book that was published called The Poison Mushroom for Children. And if you look at the cover of that book, you'll see a mushroom with the face of a Jewish person. And the idea was that if you got near a Jewish person, it would be the same as eating a poison mushroom. And it was to scare children. There are photos of little children reading that book. It was terrifying that something was going to happen to them. So this whole program of propaganda is going on until they start passing laws taking away their civil rights. And finally, there are attacks sponsored by the government, and they get worse and worse and worse, and nothing's done. I'm going to talk more about this, but I'm just giving you an overview. And then the Jewish people and others are separated, and finally, they're killed. Mass murder. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what happened. We're going to go through it now. But don't think for a moment that the only victims of the Holocaust were Jewish people. Do you know of any other victims?
Gypsies.
Gypsies. The Roma Sinti, they're called gypsies. These were people that, well, we're not sure where they ever came from, but probably somewhere in the vicinity of Asia, Eastern and Western Asia, and they came across the continent. And so these were people who were migrating all the time, and they were rovers. You know, they go from one place to another, and always suspect, involved in criminal acts sometimes, but blamed for a lot of problems. So people in general were prejudiced against the Roma Sinti. Prejudice is when you think badly about somebody, prejudge them. That's what that word means. Discrimination is when you take your prejudice and put it into action. You don't let somebody come in a door. You don't let somebody drink at a drinking fountain. You ever hear about that? In this country, you know. So it happens. Discrimination happens a lot. So They were one group of victims. Anybody know some other victims? Yes.
People with disabilities?
People with disabilities, mental or physical. Because the idea of the Nazis was we're going to create a perfect race. And so, people that were in any way disabled, and I don't know, this is not a disability because I am one, but a senior citizen. People who are older, who might not be contributing to whatever programs or whatever the Nazis were doing. So maybe older people. Who else? Other victims?
Gay people.
Homosexuals were targeted. Not a large group. Not a large group as much as others, but they were targeted and rounded up because the feeling was that not homosexual women, homosexual men, because the feeling was we can change them and make them productive German citizens. And with the women, they only wanted to use women, for example, to propagate the race. And they didn't have to be, they could just do that. See, they could force them. See? So that is another group. Anybody else? Yes.
People that were within what they named the Aryan race, critical voices, or that were conflictual because
Absolutely.
even wives of army soldiers that were demanding rights.
Of course, anybody that opened their mouth and criticized you, and that could be religious leaders, and there were religious leaders, there literary figures, professors, people like that. So anybody who was critical. Anybody else? Yes.
Jehovah's Witnesses?
Yes. Most people, I always ask, were there any religious groups that were targeted? And if a Catholic school is here, they always go, the Catholics? Yes, of course. And so were the Lutherans. There were many, many groups that were attacked. But one in particular, the Jehovah's Witnesses. Do you know why?
Tell me. I don't know why.
Because she mentioned it, I thought she might know. Because she might be a Jehovah's Witness. And if you ask the Jehovah's Witnesses, they can tell you. Usually in a group, if I say, were there any religious groups, most of the time if somebody puts their hand up and says Jehovah's Witness, they are probably a Jehovah's Witness because this is taught to the children in their Sunday school classes. They were a group of people that as a people, they refused to give allegiance to anybody but Jehovah, which is God. And they stood for that, and so many of them were persecuted. Yeah, it's great that you said that. Anybody, any political groups that you know that were targeted? Communists. These are the people. This was the system of government present in this, what we call today Russia, the Soviet Union, right? So politically, they didn't believe in them, but what the Germans and others did. They were capitalists, right? Interestingly, an observation, I'll tell you, I went to many camps and visited them. I went to one, and the camp you visit today is just the way it was in those days. It wasn't destroyed because the Russians ended up being our allies, during the war, and they freed that camp. And Majdanek. And you go there, and it's the same as it was. Everything, including the gas chambers and the ovens. Because why? I asked our leader, I said, why? And that was they refused to tear it down and destroy it because they wanted it to be a symbol of what capitalism is capable of doing. Don't you feel great when somebody tells you that? And you're there, you go, oh my. So, but whereas you go to other camps that were destroyed sometimes by the Allies.
Yeah, we were at Dachau.
Yeah, well Dachau was actually, there's a camp, Dachau was the very first, quote, camp that was set up. And that's pretty well preserved in a pristine manner. I felt that it's kind of clean. It looks like a show place. That was the first one I ever saw when I was 19 years old. And it's still that way today. Let's see, were there any other victims? I want to be sure you know that there were other victims. There's one group of people that you should know about because, gosh, almost 2 million of the Jews in this country died, and that is the country of Poland, which is just to the east of Germany. Poland has great significance too, because this really is where the Second World War begins. So the Polish people were also considered very low down in their estimation. And you gotta understand, Nazis consider these people inferior. Not human almost. You have to remember that. The way they treated people, and you see the way they treated people was to dehumanize people and make them, turn them into objects or things. And for them it was very easy because they considered these people objects and things. So that's quite a group of victims, isn't it? And we know that the perpetrators, the bad guys, were the Nazis. And before we go on, I want to tell you there were two other groups of people that you'll see as the story goes on. There were two other kinds of people involved. There were people called bystanders, who were people who stood there and watched things happen and didn't do anything about it. And sometimes German people are accused of being bystanders. Sometimes Americans are accused of that, even though the Americans did a lot, right? And the other group that I want you to think about are the people we call the heroes, the people who saved, helped to save victims. Some of them were resistors, resisted them, and some of them were just people that helped them. They were rescuers. They stood up for them. And so we have this whole group of people involved, because that's what I want you to remember. The Holocaust is a lot of things, but the Holocaust is a story of people. People. People like you and me, when you look at pictures like that and you say, that's a family out in their backyard, perhaps having a cookout. What are they doing? You know, if we took our clothes from 2020 and put them on them, it could be any of us, couldn't it? And so this story is about regular people. The Jewish people were really successful where they were living, all over the world, but here in this particular part of Europe, you know, they were doing very well. And here they are, and this happens to them. Little kids, friends, you have a wedding there, just very typical, isn't it? There's a mom taking her little kid to school, and then all of a sudden one day you wake up and look what happens. So I talked to you a little bit about World War I already, and that was kind of something that was present, you know, just kind of overlying what was happening. I talked to you about the scapegoats. So we're talking here, again, I've showed you this map already a couple times. This map shows you where it happened. A lot of times, students aren't sure about their geography, where they are. This is Europe, and it's important to remember that here is the Atlantic Ocean. Way across the Atlantic Ocean was the United States in San Antonio. And they didn't have phones where they could just pick up the phone and say, you'll never believe what's happening today. Or they had a hard time communicating. It took sometimes a long time to hear what was happening. So this is the scenario. People were doing very well, and then I told you about censorship. These are, when the Nazis took over, they began really to intimidate these people. And they did that by passing many laws limiting their freedom. And we talked already about censorship. Censorship. They ordered certain books to be collected and burned. And you'd be surprised how many authors, Ernest Hemingway, people like that, authors that you and I know, that we respect, that their books were collected. If you remember, I told you before, this is history and how much we learn from history. You know, one of the things we learned is that when you have censorship, that's a very bad sign of what's going to happen, what's happening. It's happened all the way through history, and it happened here. When you take people's rights away from reading or expressing themselves, there's going to be a problem. There is a problem. And this is exactly what they did. They went into schools and libraries and just collected books and just burned them. Just fantastic, fantastic works that they thought were threatened. Perhaps some of you have heard that of the author Helen Keller, right? You've heard of Helen Keller? Right. Why is she, let me ask you something. Why is she so famous?
Because she had syrup fever and she was blind and deaf.
She was blind and deaf, so did she do anything? She was a what? She was an author, a successful author. They burned her books. And because she was disabled, but the other reason is she was, somebody told me once she was a communist too. So she was a threat. So when you realize, wow, they burned so many books that people could have benefited from. That's a way of controlling people. You pass laws to scare people and intimidate them, right? 1933 was the year that Hitler took over, and he ordered a boycott of Jewish businesses for a day. Signs like that with soldiers there. Would you go into that store? I'm not sure I would, even if it was my friend. I'm not sure. That was to intimidate them. That was to intimidate them. They began to round up children and make them join the Hitler Youth. And there is the, I referred to this already, the rally that Hitler went to. And if you look on his shirt, you'll see the Iron Cross. And this is a rally of young people. Of young people. And this is a way what? More control. More control. Get the young people and force them to be part of what they call the Hitler Youth. I told you that some laws were passed. And here's an example. This bench says for Jews. So I always like to ask students, when they see this, why do you think that lady is covering her face? What do you think? Why do you think she's covering her face?
Because she doesn't want people to see that she's Jewish.
Okay, she doesn't want to see that she's Jewish. And so I think that's what I always thought when I saw this picture. One day a student said to me, well, wait a minute, maybe she's not Jewish, but she was sitting on the Jewish person's bench. And she saw a photographer and she didn't want anybody to know. How about that? She might have just been tired of the park and she wanted to sit down. We don't know. It's interesting to look at pictures, which, by the way, the Nazis took many pictures, many movies, because they were going to win this struggle and they were going to take over the world and they were going to have a big, big historical museum of it. They were going to have this for future generations to be able to watch. So there are many pictures. Most of the pictures in our museum, up to about right here, are actually pictures taken by the Nazis themselves, and to chronicle what was going on. So these laws are passed, and things are getting terribly hard for the Jewish people. By the way, during this time, an interesting thing students would be interested in, because I think many students read Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. Have you ever read that? No. Well, many students read that. And it was during this time when things were getting, building up. Very early on, that Otto Frank, a businessman in northern Germany, decided he would move his family to the Netherlands and take his business there. And it's that time when Anne is just a little girl that they moved there. And it's 10 years later that she's still living there. And that's what she gets for her birthday present, a diary. A diary. And she starts writing in it, and then we know the story about how they were hidden in the Netherlands. In fact, Anne's diary, everybody turns back there if you want, and see that Life magazine cover. Anne Frank is on that cover, and that's after her diary was published. And you don't notice because you don't know, but that language is Dutch, because she grew up speaking Dutch. So even people like that began to leave because they were frightened. They were afraid of what was going to happen. Well, something happens in November 1938, called the November 1938 pogrom. People call it Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. A young boy had attempted to assassinate a Jewish officer, and a couple of nights before, and the officer had died, and this was retribution. The German army and the soldier police were ordered into the streets to Jewish people's homes and businesses to just create havoc, to scare them, I guess. And so the next morning, this would be a typical picture of what you'd see. The streets were full of glass from broken windows from shops, synagogues where they worship, houses, places were burned, furniture was burned, and the Jewish people themselves were forced to go clean this up. Why is this a turning point? You have to look at how the Jewish people would have looked, the German Jewish people would have looked now when this happened. This happened to them, this pogrom, if you look it up in the dictionary, an act of violence, especially against Jewish people. That's the definition. How come this pogrom, they were saying, how could this happen? The Nazis did it nobody did anything to stop them, and they felt like they were backed into a corner. Where could they go? They had tried to leave. Some people had tried to leave unsuccessfully. Otto Frank did, but years before, 5, 6 years before that. And it was getting harder and harder for them to leave. So this was a turning point. In fact, I have read somebody's opinion that this was the beginning of the Second World War. That's in a minority, that opinion. But people said this was close to the war. People, as I said, had tried to leave. A very good example is a boat called SS St. Louis that had crossed the ocean from Europe to, they were going to Cuba. They had had a promise that they could, that Jews were welcome there and they could find help there. Over 600. There were a lot on that ship. When they got to Cuba, it turns out the Cuban people kept them waiting and waiting, and then decided not to accept them. That's very sad. The saddest thing is, as we well know, Cuba and Miami are very close, and they could actually almost see the lights from the United States, but the United States wouldn't let anybody in, so the boat had to turn around, eventually go back, and most of those people were eventually killed. So people tried to get out, but there's just so much you can do as far as the country. Finally, in 1938, at a conference in France called Wannsee, there was a group of about 30, 31 countries that came together and said, what are we going to do about all these Jewish people that are trying, these Germans that are trying to leave? What are we going to do? We only have certain quotas, limits. And the meeting pretty well came to this decision. We're not going to add any more to our quotas. And so there was no place for them to go. Think about that. As 1938 ends, just 5 years after Hitler takes over, I mean, things were terrible. As we mentioned already, Dachau that you went to, that camp had been set up in 1933, not so much to kill people, but to question people, interrogate them, intimidate. It's part of the intimidation. So here they have, at the end of 1938, what are we going to do? And things keep getting worse and worse. And then the year 1939, happens. On September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded the country from Poland. Now, this was not the first time they did that. They've been expanding their influence throughout other countries. In 1938, for example, they went into the country of Austria, Hitler's birthplace, but they were welcomed with parades, children throwing flowers. It was just a celebration. Why? There were Nazis in those countries. When they came across the border in 1939, there wasn't any welcoming heart for them. It was an act of aggression. In fact, it was an act of war. The next day, the Polish government declares war on them, and the president of Poland flees to England to be safe. And so, after about a month of resistance from the Polish forces on horseback with rifles against tanks and planes, they have to surrender. And so Hitler takes over the country of Poland. And not only does he take that country over, but he finds he has almost 2 million more Jews. And don't forget, the program was Hitler was trying to get rid of Jews, right? We talked about that. So with all those extra people, something had to be done to control them. So one idea was, we've got to separate them. Raoul Hilberg is a famous Holocaust scholar who says you can actually divide this whole part of history in Germany with the Nazis and the Jews like this. When it first began, we talked earlier, laws passed, censorship, propaganda, you will not live among us as Jews. We're going to try to get you to leave. And some people, like Otto Frank, left. People tried to leave. As things got harder and harder to do, then the people couldn't leave. Well, the Nazis then said, well, you will not live among us as Jews. We're not going to let you live among us. What we're going to do is we're going to order that you must leave your homes, your apartments, wherever you are, and we're going to centralize you to have more control. So, The ghettos were established in 1940. Sections of older cities that were walled off, fenced off, blocked off. And people were forced out of their homes, Jewish people, to go and live in these parts of the cities, in older apartments, places that weren't so nice. And it wasn't so nice because sometimes, say in a 3-bedroom apartment, 4 families would be moved in there. 20, 25 people, each getting a room. You have to understand, these were not luxury apartments. They were old. Sometimes the heat didn't work. Sometimes the water wasn't warm, hot water. They didn't have enough food. People got sick. It was a terrible situation. Even though in some of the ghettos, there was an attempt to have a normal life, but things got worse and worse. It didn't get better. They even allowed the Jews to have committees to run the place, but they were run with the Nazis, of course, overriding what they were going to say. So every morning, this is a scene you would see. Every morning you would find children who were sick or children that had died. And so there's a great cemetery in Warsaw that many, many people buried there. Unfortunately today it's overgrown. It's really hard to see the graves unless somebody in the United States usually has paid money to clear it out. But this happened every day. And I guess the Nazis said, well, this will weed everybody out and try to keep control. And I want you to remember that the war, they were fighting a war now. Yes, they had invaded Poland, but Poland had allies. France and England had joined, and also then eventually Russia joined. So there were allies on both sides, to the east and to the west, and here was Germany in the middle fighting a war and trying to collect all the Jews and manage that. So that was something that faced them. Many mornings, bodies would have to be carted out and taken to burial. Just a terrible, terrible situation. Things got worse and worse in the ghettos, and the war went on. And eventually, a year or so later, the Nazis said, what are we going to do here? We got this war going on. I mean, they didn't sit down and say it like that, but this is what was the situation. The war was going on 2 fronts, and they had this problem of all these Jewish people in the ghettos. So a meeting was held. I just realized I said something wrong. At Wannsee was in Germany. Evian was where that one in 1938. I just said the wrong name to you, sorry. At a resort called Wannsee, there was a meeting of some of the major leaders of the Nazi party, and to decide what to do with this problem of the Jewish people. And whenever I ask students, well, if you have a problem, what do you need? There's always one student that says, what? You need a solution. So that was the name they gave this, very cleverly, didn't they? They called this the final solution. Both in German and in English and all over the world, they talked about the final solution. So the final solution, that doesn't sound so bad, does it? I mean, what was that anyway? Nobody knew. The final solution was, we're going to close the ghettos. We're going to close the ghettos, and we're going to transport people to centers that have been set up to exterminate them and kill them, get rid of them. I heard somebody say that that's when they decided to build these centers and build these places where they were going to be gassed and cremated. But I'm going to tell you something. I was in Auschwitz, so the anniversary of which its closing we celebrated yesterday, 75 years ago. I was at Auschwitz. In one of the rooms you go into, it's kind of like a museum, you could actually go walk along the wall and see plans for these death centers, for these ovens, and for these places where they're going to be gassed. And when you look at them, you're kind of surprised because the dates of those plans are in the 1920s. And they have them. We have them on the wall for the public to see. They're authentic. So these things this plan was already in place. These places were already ready. They didn't just say one morning, oh, let's just do it. And they did. Oh, no. It was ready. It shows you how duplicitous, how deceiving and cunning they were. So, people began to be moved out of the ghettos. Now, I will tell you, in Russia, there was an attempt to terminate Jewish people using mobile killing squads, or Einsatzgruppen. Killing squads. They would take police or military, and they go out their guns to kill them. Read a book about that. It was not an easy thing for these men to do, even though they were military or police and they were supposedly faithful to the Nazis. They were Nazis, but it was very hard. They write in there how hard it was to put a gun to the back of somebody's head and kill them, and many of them would have to drink all night, vodka all night, so they could be able to do it. Many deserved it. They just couldn't do it. It wasn't a program that was going to last a long time. It was basically people were shot and put into large pits and then covered. But you know, in the springtime after the snow melted, the Nazis finally realized there would be what? Evidence. People would find that, you know. So this program was discontinued, but many, many people were killed. I'd like to show everybody this picture. I can't say this is up here on the top, but I'll show you here on the screen. This is for me, one of the most provocative pictures for me. I can't say it's my favorite picture, but to me, this photo says so much, because I told you there were people who were resistants. Remember? They resisted the Nazis. There were people who did things like write against them and have small little uprisings and things like that. In fact, in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was an incredible uprising, and many people died, but many of them got away. Well, this is a very good example of spiritual resistance. See, there was physical resistance. Take guns and shoot people, beat you up, do things like chop down a tree, let it fall over a road where some tanks, Nazis were coming, they'd have to get out and move. You know, there were all kinds of examples of resistance and spiritual resistance. There were many ways that they talked about spiritual resistance. Many times when the Jews were finally put into some of these camps, these extermination centers, they would eat the little bit that they gave them sometimes when they wanted to give up. Somebody'd say, eat, don't let them kill you, don't let them have their way. Well, this was the way that this family decided to resist. Let me show you this. You have, by the way, all ladies, all women, don't you? Because many times when the Nazis dealt with people, they separated the men and the women. Do you remember a few minutes ago I told you about dehumanizing people? How do you dehumanize a family? Separate them. Treat them like cattle, like animals. Here's the women of this family. You have grandma, then you have mom over here, 2 teenage girls, and if you look behind, you have 1 or 2 sets of feet, you have little kids. And they've been stripped down to practically nothing, dehumanizing them, taking their clothes away. And they are going to be shot. Have you seen the background, many dead bodies? They're ready to be executed. But look at them. They're holding their arms together. And their statement to the whole world now is, you might be killing us, our bodies, but you will not kill our family. We're going to die together. You can't break that bond. And they were killed like that. They didn't survive.
You know, I read a book called The Kindly One.
Mm-hmm.
It won a French Pulitzer.
Mm-hmm.
It was wrote by an SS officer who was a homosexual in the Nazis. And it details how he went from having feelings to doing this and how it affected his whole life.
Mm-hmm.
It was excellent.
Yeah, there are many good books on the Holocaust. Ordinary Men is a book about the people like this fellow who had ordinary men. One day they're ordinary men, the next day they're putting a rifle in the back of somebody's head. And they taught there how to put it in the right place, and otherwise they wouldn't die right away. I mean, it must have been horrible. And plus, you know, they're throwing them in the pits, not necessarily dead all the time. So this was a horrible thing. Didn't last very long because there were many problems with it. They found it was easier to mass execute people, to close the ghettos and deport them, take them to centers that had been set up, I told you a long time ago, you know, had been ready to go. They would be transported like animals. They were actually transported in cars like this, many of which would be actually cars that were designed to transport and ship supplies or animals. They would be put in a car like this. they'd be told at the ghetto, everybody, take your things. Sometimes they were told, we're going to a better place, you're gonna have land, you're gonna have new houses. And sometimes people believed it, but they would gather people. Every day the Nazis would say, we need so many thousand people. And they would take them, stuff them in these cars. And try to imagine what that might have been like. To have a car that was maybe about half the size of this room, a couple hundred people maybe, stuffed in here. Now where are they coming from? The ghetto. The ghetto where they had lived in terrible conditions. You remember? It had been filthy. Who knows what was wrong with them? Many of them were sick, starving, put onto these cars, and taken away sometimes for a day, 2 days, for a week, however long it took to get to where they were going. Not given any food or water, probably. Terrible conditions. A bucket of water in one corner for what?
Bathroom.
No, that was, the water was the what? Drink, but how could you get water if you were on that side? You couldn't get to it. Beautiful scene in Schindler's List, that movie, if you've ever seen it, when he gets, they were going to give him something to drink. Remember what he does? Gets the hose and he sprays it's a hot day in summer. He sprays the car, and you get a little water through there. No, then there was an empty bucket for the restroom, but nobody could get there either. So, of course, people died in these cars. And sometimes by moving the bodies around, they say that the survivors told us they would have more room. So these people were transported. They were transported for, like I say, sometimes for quite a while, and they would arrive at these centers. These are pictures from Auschwitz, the camp I told you about that was actually free 75 years ago yesterday. Just thousands of people. There's 1 million people down here. Thousands of people came on a daily basis. And they were sorted out by the officers. And they were told to go to one side or the other. And when they got there, they would simply go like this, right, left, right, left. You went to the left, you usually were sick, old, disabled, challenged in some way, or child. Children under 14 did not survive. Out of all the millions that were killed, 1.5 million, 1.5 million children were killed. It's a lot of people because, you know what, it's not 1.5 million. It's how many could they have had if they got married and had children? I always say it's 3 million or more. Right here in San Antonio, by the way, the symbol for all the children who died is the butterfly. Here in San Antonio at this time down at the Institute of Texas Cultures, there's an exhibit that's you can go see about this. Some teenagers in San Antonio last summer studied butterflies and also studied the butterfly in relationship to the Holocaust, and they made some butterflies. It's a wonderful exhibit there, and I encourage you to go see it. It's going to be there, I think, till March. So these people would go to one side, and they would be dead, they say, within 2 hours. Some people would be saved. Some people would be saved, and they would do various tasks, various jobs for the Nazis. Many of them, if they were musicians, they got to be in the camp band, orchestra, so that when prisoners came, there would be music playing sometimes. Because after all, the Germans were a civilized nation. Literate, etc., etc. And some of them who were saved at that moment would be forced to do slave labor. And some of them would be worked to death. People have survived who somehow managed to get through all this. You have to remember that they would be given around 600 calories a day to eat. Some kind of a soup they would give in the morning. 600 calories is just like a few Triscuits, or a Big Mac is 580 calories, and that's all they would get. And they'd have to work sometimes terrible labor, hard work all day. So of course many of them got sick and died, but many didn't. I mean, here's an old lady and these little kids going to the gas chamber. they would go, if they went to the gas chamber, they would be put into a room, and you see, I've been in this might be the one I was in. The rooms are very small, sometimes half the size of this room here, or maybe the size of this room. They'd pack them in there, close the door, and they would allow to enter there a gas called Cyclone B. In German, it's Giftgas. There's no gift. That's the way you see. Cyclone B was a pesticide. It was a pesticide that was not good for human beings to ingest. This is ironic. There are many ironies, but this is really ironic. Back when Hitler began his career, he wrote, remember, the book called Mein Kampf, and in that book, he called the Jewish people vermin, and here they're using a pesticide to kill them. So many people would go in there, when they were gassed, it was a horrible experience. Their body would just quit, but there would be great suffering before that. And so people would die in the gas chamber, trying to get out, even some of them trying to climb up, but they couldn't. So then their bodies would be taken out, sometimes by Jewish prisoners, and transported into these upgrade houses to burn the evidence. They'd be burned to ashes. When you go to visit some camps today, they will tell you that you're walking on human DNA. They'll tell you to this day, 75 years later. And it's a very, very harrowing experience when you go there. It's really tough to take. As I said, some people were forced to work till they died. On the right, you see something interesting. Bags full of human hair. Their hair would be shaved and they would ship the hair back to be used to stuff car seats and pillows back in Germany. In fact, everything that was taken away from them would be sent back to Germany to be sold. This was a business. And at the end of the war, they had taken so much, their suitcases and clothing and glasses and brushes and jewelry and everything. They'd taken so much they found vast warehouses full of this material at the end of the war. Now, as the war came to a close, after the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, the Germans began to lose. They began to be pushed back. The Allies, with the Americans in the war then, were pushing them back from the west. The D-Day in Normandy happened, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Nazis began to lose the war. So what they would do is they began to retreat back to the middle of Germany, to Berlin. And as they did, there were camps that they would have to close, right? Because the Allies would be right on their backs, ready to get them. So they would make prisoners come with them sometimes on forced marches. And many prisoners died on these marches because they were so weak and so sick, and so they would just leave them by the roadside. And so the prisoners would be gone, and then some camps, like Auschwitz, yesterday, 1945, January 27th, the Allies would come and they would free or liberate the camps. And here they are raising the American flag. So these are American forces who came to Dachau and freed that camp. And the people they found there were in pretty bad shape. They were starving, they were half dead, or half alive, however you look at it. Many of them did not make it much after this. They were so sick. Things like this, abandoned rail cars with bodies, it was just terrible. And of course the Allies did all they could to help these people. But you could see they were just in terrible, terrible shape. This is a terrible picture. This is the camp where Anne and her sister died of typhus. It was so contagious that they could not do anything but get the bodies into a big pit and cover it, because otherwise people were getting sick. The Nazis began to, the Jewish people and other victims would get, they'd get a new life. They probably couldn't go back to their houses, somebody was living in it already. The camps, many of them were cleaned up and turned into displaced persons camps. They would register people, and they would then have people like Americans helping them to get to other places. Most of the survivors that did survive went they went everywhere. They went to a lot of places, but they went to a lot to America and a lot to Palestine, where they would struggle for another 3 years till the state of Israel was begun. Even though the Nazis tried, people still had their faith, tried to get rid of it, that people still had their faith, and many people said this was what kept them going, a faith that would not be lost. As I told you, there were many resistors, many people helped. People like this priest that saved children. Here are the fishermen in Denmark who saved 7,200 Jews by taking them across the boat at night to the country of Sweden, which was neutral. These fellas this was a Japanese delegate in the consulate there who signed visas to his arm. They had to hold his arm up so he could sign enough visas to get people out of the country. So many people helped. Oscar Schindler. Resistance, the partisans in the woods would try to attack the Nazis and try to stop what they were doing. New life began, and finally, out of the ashes, what happened was many Nazi criminals were rounded up, and there were 12 separate trials, many of those criminals were sentenced to death, to life in prison, prison terms. Some of them got off, not too many. Some even killed themselves. But there was justice. There still is. There's still people like this man, Adolf Eichmann, one of the worst of the perpetrators. He escaped to South America, but in 1959 he was found, he was brought back to Israel, tried, and executed. So they did not get away with it. They don't get away with it. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of all the Allied forces, made many of his generals and officers come and look and see, very wisely, to be sure. He said, the things I saw beggar description. I made the visit in order to give first-hand evidence. If in the future there develop a tendency to change these allegations to mere propaganda, and people have tried to deny what happened. Yeah, I've already referred to that. Now, it's a lot of information. I've been talking for a long time. Some things for people to think about. But we here at the museum, when somebody comes here, we give the students a card that says, now that you know, what will you do? And I think that's everybody's challenge, whether you're a young person or not. Now that you know this story, what will you do? Why has the state of Texas, and just yesterday, the entire country legislated that all children will study the Holocaust? Why is that? It's because it is such a terrible act of hatred. It's a terrible period of our history that we want to remember it not for the thrill, but for what we learned from it. So when we stand with the survivors, and there are not many of them, but the survivors today that say, don't forget, remember, that is the message of the Holocaust. Remember, so nothing like this can ever happen again in history. Thank you so much for your time, for listening, and thank you for remembering.